Let's see if I can do this right the first time. Yes, I did. Love it. Hello, people. We are just waiting for some people to come in, waiting until I see Pinhook. Today we are going to be talking to the Sean Joseph, master blender and co-founder of Pinhook Bourbon. Hello, guys. Hello. So if you guys have any questions, same as any of our previous lives, feel free to just submit them. And obviously, if time allows, then I will try to get to everyone's questions. Hello. Okay, let's see. Is Pinhook popped in here yet? Don't think so. Now, for those of you who are not super familiar with Pinhook, I've got one of the bottles here that we're going to be talking about today. True small batch. This is the 2022 iteration. So we'll be talking about that and the Bourbon War vertical that will be coming out very soon, the 7-year. I think that might be the oldest vertical they've released so far. So we'll get into that. Ah, there we go. Hello. All right. Now let's get it started. I'm about to send you an invite, Sean. So yes, guys, if anyone has any questions for Mr. Sean Joseph, feel free to send them in. Or you can ask in the comments, either way. There we go. Hello, sir. How are
Hey, what's
you?
up?
Likewise. Oh, good.
Good to see you.
My Pinhook ball in the background. Okay. I always try to be.
I can. It's like nicely over your right shoulder.
Here.
I appreciate that.
How are you, sir? Thank you for joining me this fine afternoon.
I am doing great. It's awesome to be here.
Yes,
Thank you. I can get you one of these for sure.
So, Mr. Sean Joseph, Joseph's with an S, correct? Not Joseph. How often has that happened?
With an S.
Yeah. I can only imagine. Is everyone is just determined to say Joseph?
So, correct. In fact, this is, I think, a good indication of the way people listen. My wife's name is Mani, Mani. And so anytime, I think it's pretty, but anytime she introduces herself, she says, hello, I'm Mani. Mostly they'll say Bonnie, or they'll say Marnie. They'll say anything but Mani. And then when I introduce myself, even if I say my first name first, which obviously I would, I'm like, I'm Sean Joseph. So they're like, hello,
goodness.
Joseph. It's
I'm
nice
surprised
to
they
meet
don't
you.
try to call you Sean Joseph. Like,
I'm like, did you?
know, there's people who have two first names.
Like it's
exactly.
Well, I do live in New Orleans, like the land of double names. So.
Are you from New Orleans?
I once got something.
Oh, nice.
My wife is from here, so we've lived here for about 8 years. Yeah, it's so awesome.
I was just there
when was the last time you were here?
Yeah, I was there for the whole week.
Oh,
I love it. I missed it. I haven't been back since 2019 before then, so it was definitely overdue.
I always tell people come in October.
Why October? Is it a good time for the weather?
Because it's Halloween, and they love Halloween here. Like, people do the most beautiful decorations. The weather is perfect. You haven't hit any of the big. It's like leading up to the holidays, so it already has this like great festive energy here, but there's no big thing going on, so it's not overcrowded.
I love that. I can imagine because it's always crowded for tails, and there's always like a ton of other things, exactly, hot and rainy. But there's always a ton of other activities and conferences and stuff that happens within that same like 2 to 3 week span in July. So yeah, I definitely got to come back, and I'm going to take your advice and try to come back in October.
I would.
Yes, I would definitely give you the heads up before.
And show you also the rest of the rest of the city too, because it's. I think everyone always ends up in the corridor.
Yeah, exactly. I actually, thankfully, a friend of mine, Capri, she has friends in New Orleans, so we got to get pulled away from that corridor just a little bit, but definitely did not scratch the surface. I already know. So you'll be getting that heads
there's
up when I
a lot
finally
to be
put my
done.
phone. Okay, so let's start from the beginning because I've gotten the cliff notes on
Yeah,
Pinhook through Blake, but I like to take these
yeah,
opportunities to do more of a deep dive into how brands like yours even come to be. There's so many like nuanced
yeah,
facets to Pinhook and the brand, the aesthetic, and everything. So I'm definitely ready to kind of deep dive into how all of that even came to be. So let's start with you being a
yeah, for sure.
restaurateur. So, what does a hospitality
Yeah.
man, how did they wind up deciding they wanted to create their own bourbon brand? Well, whiskey brand now because it's beyond bourbon, but
Well, yeah, I
and
think
sommelier.
so.
Let me be
I
clear.
opened and sommelier. Yeah, so I started. Well, my wife
Oh,
has a restaurant in New York called Tia Paul. It's a Spanish tapas restaurant on 10th Avenue and 22nd. It
oh
just
wow.
celebrated
Oh,
18 years
congrats to your
in
wife.
business,
That's
which
a feat
is
for sure. Yeah.
kind of amazing. It is definitely a feat. And I started working there as a food runner. So that was my introduction to hospitality, and I fell in love with it. And that led me to work in other restaurants. I went more the fine dining route because I decided then that I wanted restaurants to be my career. And so I went to work at a restaurant called Chanterelle, which was a four-star restaurant, a restaurant called Per Se, which was a four-star restaurant,
Hmm.
Thomas Keller's New York restaurant. Um, and then that's when I went down the wine
Nice.
rabbit hole, became a sommelier. I'm making that sound like it was easy. It's not
Definitely
the
not the
hardest thing in the
easiest
world,
either.
but
Yeah.
didn't happen overnight. But but that was the next step. And I just had really gotten into bourbon along with my sommelier studies, and I find that that's true of a lot of my friends who are sommeliers. Is then they'll like get into something else as well, sake, or it could be beer, or it could be they might get into mezcal, whatever it is. But you already know how to learn about a category, and you have familiarization. You're familiar with
Mhm.
fermentation and just some of the basic concepts. And I think most importantly, you've
For
learned how to
sure.
taste um, deductively, not just like I like it, I don't like it, but more trying to think about the structure. Um, but anyway, I just love bourbon, and this was like in
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Yeah, that
2005,
was a while ago.
right? So there were no expensive
Very
bourbons.
true.
So imagine you feel like you've built your palate, you're working in restaurants, you've done all these wine blind tastings, and you're trying to think about how good something is quality relative to price. And then you're like going into a store and they have Van Winkle 13-year rye for $55. And you're like, this is a rather complex,
Yeah.
delicious spirit for $55. I kind
What
of
a
like
day in
this. And
time.
so the short story is yeah, exactly. And so that really, and it does tie back to New Orleans too, right? So I'd been spending a lot of time in New Orleans, got interested in, just Southern food culture and bourbon, obviously. I think now more ties broadly to all over the country, but I think of it at the
It
time
definitely
was really more of
started,
like a
yeah, with
Southern
more southern
thing.
roots for sure.
Yeah. So basically I had this idea to open an American whiskey bar and
Mm-hmm.
restaurant. And so I opened a spot called
Mm-hmm.
Char Number Four in Brooklyn in 2008, which is way ahead of
For
the
sure. When
slow
I saw the
bourbon
name of it, because
boom.
when I did a little bit of my deep dive, I saw the name of it. I was like, wow, he was kind of ahead of his
Yeah,
time on the naming because nobody was talking about chart numbers and all of that up
yeah,
until like within the past five or so, maybe not even 10 years, like 5 or so years, when people started to
yeah,
really nerd out about the categories.
yeah, yeah. There was really nothing. I mean, my recollection at the time is, you had Roof
Mm-hmm.
on Main, and in the 21C Hotel in Louisville. You had a place called Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville, and then there in Lexington, there's Bluegrass Tavern. But even in Kentucky, I was really
Yes.
only aware of those three places. Is like you would go in, and it's like there's all
Yeah.
of this bourbon, and rye, American whiskey. But outside of that, there was
Do
nothing.
you think that people were slow
Right?
to
There's
kind of
Delilah's. There's
merge like restaurants, fine dining, that type of thing, merging it with
whiskey, like American whiskey in
Yeah.
particular, because Scotch is always in a fine dining spot.
Yeah.
Like we've been seeing that forever. But
Yeah.
yes, it seems like they were a little slow on the curve in terms of like really meshing the two worlds together, even though both can fall under hospitality, just depending on how you approach it.
Although I agree, but I also blame the bourbon industry for not
Yeah,
marketing their
for sure.
product, right? So no one thought of it. No one thought of it as like a fine sipping whiskey. Now, you had at that time, Blanton's was the first ever single barrel, which was created in 1984. Beam started creating their small batch series in the early 90s. So that was the beginning of like, oh, look, there's a copper band on it and it's got this crafty looking paper and you're trying to make it feel more special. But I'd still say the industry as a whole wasn't making you feel like this is a really special product the way we think about single malt scotch or even the finest, blended scotches. And so, I remember friends at other restaurants giving me their pappy because they're like, nobody wants a $20 bourbon, like a glass of bourbon, right? So I just don't think the perception was there, right? I mean, it also ties into, someone was telling me this the other day, the peak of bourbon consumption was 1976 in the United States of America, and we're still we're like, oh, there's this crazy bourbon boom, but we're only two-thirds of where we were in the mid-70s.
And bourbon has evolved so much.
And then that's when things started to, and that's when things really started to tail off because vodka and I think particularly vodka and gin became more popular, and clear spirits were marketed as being more like healthy, which is obviously makes no sense, but like that was and then vodka had its time, and so the bourbon really went into the doldrums. And I think especially during that time, I don't think the industry was doing anything to really get people excited about the category. So I think we saw this real boom take off in like 2011, 2012, around then. But anyway, I guess to get back to the real point of your question, I was in my bourbon bar looking at the world of American whiskey, and because there weren't really allocated items, when I looked up at the shelf behind my bar, and the only thing on the shelf that held a couple hundred bottles, it was all American, right? Was all the BTAC and all the Pappy and Rittenhouse 25 year and anything you can think of, plus like some collectible stuff from Japan and London and whatnot. But as you know, at that time, I mean, there was basically no craft distilleries. And so all I saw was a world of opportunity to do something different. And I think what I remember feeling was that, wow, it's like bourbon is so tasty, but the category is very boring because it's just, they're 9 big distilleries. They produce all the labels, and each, like, think about it now. It's like now, even within Wild Turkey, they have all these offshoots. But at the time, it's just like, it's the Wild Turkey rye and the Wild Turkey bourbon. And it was all very right down the middle. I mean, people forget, but even in 2008, 2009, Maker's Mark produced one product.
True.
There was no small batch
There was
select.
no what Maker's
there
like
was,
what 46?
There was no cast strength. There was no 46. 46 was the first thing to come out, right? After, but their whole claim to fame is we make one thing. And then you'd look at Jim Beam and it's like, it's white label, black label, right? Jim Beam, Jim Beam rye. There was this weird product called Rye One with like a lowercase r and a one that was out for a minute. I don't think that did very well. Red Stag, like there just wasn't, and no one was really into single barrel picks, right? So that's the other thing. So all these things
because everyone and their cousin has a single barrel,
right? That single barrel finishes, the fact that they're craft distilleries. The only craft I remember being on the shelf was there was Falcones wasn't even out yet. There was
I remember when they came out, or when they really started to like circle.
Stranahan's. Yeah. There was Stranahan's, was already out. There was St. George's, that makes Charbet out of California. There's a McCarthy's, which is a peated single malt out of Oregon. That existed. And then, in terms of non-distiller producers, High West had maybe literally just launched. Whistle Pig had just launched. And, maybe I think Jefferson's had been around since like the mid 90s. And then you did have Kentucky Bourbon Distillers, right? So there was Willet,
She clearly is enjoying what you're talking about, little deer
um,
cat. She's
I love it.
Get down, girl.
There was Willet Pot Still, there was Johnny Drum, like that, some of that stuff from KVD. So there really was, to me, nothing but opportunity to say there's got to be other perspectives, on what could be interesting. And the main thing that occurred to me, because I had a wine background, was why can't you make vintages?
And I was gonna ask you about that.
Right.
In terms of the wine background, yeah.
Yeah, so that was really it. It was really that simple. I was like, I don't understand. To me, it was more like, I guess, just philosophical, which is in wine, making the same flavor profile, even as the vintages change, but you always want the wine to taste the same, is basically how you make mediocre to subpar wine. And good, right? And good wine is a celebration.
It's meant to
of
be
vintage.
a place
You're
in
not
time.
trying to
not meant to
influence a place in time. I need to write that down, because I think that's so perfectly said, and because I think that's actually a better way in some ways of saying vintage, and it's what a single barrel represents, and it's what our entire ethos is just about representing our whiskey as a place in time, and saying that place in time is going to always keep moving. And wouldn't it be interesting to visit all those different places in time, as opposed to trying to hide the variability through blending? You can show variability through blending. That's a choice, right? And most distilleries make the choice to hide the variability, because when they go to do a new batch, they don't have the same barrels that they had before. There's variability in the whiskey in the barrels for all the reasons that we know. And what they do is they have a formula for how do we blend the right barrels together so you can't tell the difference between one batch and the
all
next.
of your, because I know it's at least for the vertical, there's particular vintages every year that come out. But so all of your releases, are they all single barrels, or any of them blend? Well, you're a blender, so then there are blends.
It's all, so all of our blends, so even like our flagship product is an orange wax bourbon. Like that's our everyday pour. And then we have a green wax.
So those are your two flagships, the orange wax and the green wax.
So even those are our two flags, orange and green. But even those are produced as vintages.
And the names change.
When I make the vintage,
so it's the horse name.
The names of it's a different horse. Yeah, the different horse. Exactly. And that really, I mean, they're active racing thoroughbreds, but I feel like the most important thing about the horses is kind of like a metaphor, is that they represent the idea that it's something unique. It's not the same thing you have last time. Right. And also the geometry on the label changes, right? So any bottle for the 2022 vintage, some people have called this the bikini one, but I don't know what it's supposed to be. But last year was more of this kind of like triangle pattern. So that's the other fun thing for people who get into collecting, is there's a visual identity
for each release.
Which also came out of, one of my other co-founders did all of our packaging.
Oh,
that's
nice.
what he does for a living. And what I had started to notice was, I started to see that people were collecting, right? But what I noticed was, like, if you collect BTAC, for example, and you have different years of BTAC, all the bottles look the same, and you have to check the serial number, or you have to look for something really small. And so if you've been to some of these big bourbon bars, they might have 7 stags up there, and then they'd have to like
to see which one is which,
a tag on the back to say this was, to see which is which. Yes, same thing. So a part of the big idea of this was like, well, wouldn't it be fun if you were collecting, if that became visual as well, so that if you had the same expression of Pinhook, like let's say our true small batch, but you had it in 4 different vintages, then when you looked up on your shelf, you'd see.
I love the Pinhook bottles. If for nothing else,
each bottle looks different.
Obviously good too, but I love the fact that the labels are so intentionally thought about, because it makes it pretty to display on your bar. Like I'm a person that likes to put stuff in color order, so my OCD gets very excited
I love
when it comes to the Pinhook bottles.
but that's, yeah, but I think that, I mean, that it's a great point though, too, because the other opportunity we had, right, all of us and there were three of us that founded the company, was standing at the bar at Char Number 4, looking at the world of American whiskey and basically just seeing a sea of basically like brown and black labels, right? Like everything's dark. And it just seemed like there was so much room to do something that was, on the one hand, I think our approach in terms of the whiskey itself, because we're not doing finishes and things of that nature, is kind of classic, right? But then within that, we're doing vintages, we're changing the labels, we have these bright colors.
I decided to do my whiskey in a wine glass today.
So I appreciate that.
I do this at home anyway, but I don't usually do that like publicly. So this is an appropriate time to do it anytime.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
So so we haven't gotten our hands on the 7-year bourbon war yet, but we will be soon. So right now I'm sipping on the true small batch that we just got in. So I was doing Google trying to figure out what the hell the word Pinhook even means. And there's a lot of real vague stuff. Someone was referencing tobacco and someone was referencing a fish hook and all this stuff. So what is the significance of the name Pinhook and why for a whiskey brand?
So and you're right. It was, the reason we came across it is one of my founding partners, his best friend from high school, grew up in thoroughbred horse racing. His father was a vet at the track, and then he ended up being in the industry. And one of the things that he does is pinhooking. And so and that's actually, and it's not just like a fantasy name, like it's his job. Like he's like, if you were to ask Jamie, like, what do you do? He would say, well, we have a racing stable and then I also pinhook. And so in thoroughbred horse racing, a pinhook is you buy a baby thoroughbred based on its lineage with the explicit intent of selling it for a profit when it's mature. So it's like flipping a house, but you're flipping a horse. You buy them young because you know that when they mature, someone will pay more for than you did because it's filled out into looking like a great thoroughbred. And so also kind of going back in time, one of the things I found frustrating back in, early mid 2000s was there was a lot of misrepresentation of where's this from, what is it, people pretending they had distilleries when they didn't. And I just always thought that was silly. Like, why not be transparent? So we love the idea of being transparent that we buy and sell barrels, especially because we knew that we didn't want to distill. And so Jamie had explained this term to us and we're like, oh, that's kind of cool. I mean, it started with us just connecting the dots and saying like, oh, well, we're kind of pinhooking bourbon. We buy baby bourbon based on like its lineage, like where it was distilled, and then, sell it when it's mature. And then Jamie has a racing stable called Bourbon Lane Stable, which already existed. And he names every horse in the stable with Bourbon or Rye, the name of the horse. So from that point, after coming up the name Pinhook, it was very easy to then say, well, why not? Wouldn't it be fun to really illustrate the fact that each vintage is a unique whiskey in the bottle to connect it to a different active racing thoroughbred? So Jamie picks whichever thoroughbred in his stable he thinks has the best chance of winning the Kentucky Derby. And that's the horse. And that's, so he picks the horse for each year. But to me, and I think it's the part that to us that's important, that feels authentic, is to do a commemorative bottle of a horse that's already a champion. I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with that, but then it's just a commemorative bottle. The idea of this is it might become a commemorative bottle because the horse ends up doing really well, or the horse might really not do well because it's a very, tricky and challenging business. But you're kind of, that's part of the fun, is you don't know how that horse is going to do.
That's pretty cool. Okay. And so were you behind the design of you guys' bottles? Because it's giving very much wine bottle in terms of aesthetic, shape, even with the wax.
It was really a credit to my founding partner, Charles. And so, as I was saying, that's he wasn't just like a hobbyist, like he's a creative in the design world. And so it was really one of those unique situations where we were 3 people that founded the company. We started by buying 20 barrels of MGP bourbon that was 3 years old in 2011, and it cost $465 a barrel.
That's beautiful.
The last time I checked, it's $2,700 a barrel for 2-year-old right now. And at one point it was closer to 10 times
It's like
what we
real
paid.
estate.
So
Jesus.
that's to me the magic. It's like real estate. I mean, man, I think if you had bought whatever, 1,000 barrels or 10,000 barrels of that at the time, I mean, who knows what each one of those barrels would be worth right now? It would be 14-year-old whiskey right now, and it would be worth an obscene amount of money. But the cool thing about it was, and it's also very indicative of the time, was we started the company for $9,000, right? That's what it cost to buy 20 barrels. And then we shipped the barrels from MGP to Bardstown, Kentucky, and we were paying $1 per barrel per month for storage. So the total cost to start the company was $9,000 plus, $240 a year in storage.
Wow.
And those were our only costs.
That's pretty amazing. Considering if somebody tried to do the same thing now,
it's good to be early.
The same thing now, it's easy, like triple price. Just to even get started.
It would be hard. Yeah, it would be really hard now, and it's hard because if you paid. I mean, someone asked me the other day. Someone DM'd me, and they're like, "Hey, I'm really curious to get into this, and what would it take?" And I wasn't trying to discourage them. I was just saying, here's the tough part right now. If you wanted to buy 3-year-old Kentucky juice, right? 4-year-old Kentucky juice, something in that range, it's going to cost you $4,000 a barrel. And in order to make money, like to make even decent margin on that, you're going to have to be at like $80 on the shelf. And I said, that's not a very competitive,
especially as a new brand,
as a new brand and at that age. So, and I was pointing out similarly, we're on the shelf for $37 with a blend of 3 and 4-year-old barrels because we bought barrels early. And then also we signed a long-term contract where, we're paying for new make, which is way cheaper than paying for aged whiskey. But because we were ahead, we had the time to let the whiskey age up.
That is pretty good.
And the carrying costs, the carrying costs of a barrel are very cheap. Like it probably costs like maybe, I want to say, maybe it would cost like, including insurance, I'm just trying to think of this, $50 a year to store and insure an individual barrel. But I guess my point is, right, if you bought a barrel for $2,000, the $50 per year to carry it is pretty insignificant. So as long as you have the time, if you buy early and you have the time to let everything age up, then you're in good shape. But if you have to buy 3, 4, 5-year-old stuff, you're just going to pay an arm and a leg. And then,
that's some crazy startup cost.
Try to price it based on, it would be really expensive. And then I just also think your shelf price wouldn't make sense. You don't want to have an $80 3-year-old product on the shelf.
No, I mean, for what they're paying for that price point, people are going to be expecting more than a 3-year-old, even though I am not opposed to well done young whiskey, but
no, I'm not opposed to it. I love well done young whiskey. I just don't think in the competitive landscape when, Knob Creek is 9 years old and is going to cost $36 or whatever. Like it's a tough
you gotta
place
have
to
some
be
special juice
charging
for 3 years
for
to
3-year-old.
charge that price for it.
You better, yeah.
So Castle Key is who you guys is that who you guys have worked with essentially since buying the MGP that you started with?
Well, we had bought and then subsequently bought more MGP, and then the Castle and Key thing was just pure luck, which was Jamie, who I mentioned was our friend in the horse business. His best friend, Will Arvin, was the guy who decided to buy this dilapidated ruin of a distillery. So we were the first people that they approached about having a contract because they knew, going back to maybe some people find this the fun part, but the business side, you buy a distillery, you spend a lot of money restoring it, you need to make money, you make vodka and gin, which they do, but then you also and then you start distilling bourbon for yourself, but you can make good money distilling bourbon and rye for other people. So they knew that they wanted to do contract distillation. And so we were the first people to sign a contract with them. And so that was just pure dumb luck. And we feel so fortunate because, I mean, maybe I feel this way a little less as time has passed, but certainly at the time when we founded the company, we're like, Kentucky's where all the magic is. And so even though we had no choice and no opportunity to buy anything other than Indiana barrels, our hope was always to have Kentucky whiskey. So then the fact that we now have our own custom mash bill of bourbon and rye from one of the most historic distilleries in the history of bourbon is just
really
incredibly
cool.
lucky.
So when you're doing a blend, what's your approach to that? Like, what are you looking for when you do a blend? Because you're not looking for everything to taste the same. So
it's a great quote. Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's where the wine training really comes in because, you know, I was trying to explain this to someone the other day, right? The difference between just being a casual drinker and enjoyer of things versus a connoisseur is that a connoisseur understands that when something's of quality, even if it's not to their palate.
That's so true. Oh, that's so true.
Right? Like you could say, for example, I hate peated scotch. Never want to drink it. That said, if you put your professional tasting hat on, then you need to say, I'm tasting these 5 peated whiskeys and I need to judge them for quality. And that's what you're taught in wine, right? Is you're analyzing the structure of the wine, not like, nah, I don't like it that much, or ooh, this is really delicious. You're actually trying to figure out, like, is there a good balance between tannin and acidity? Are the tannins refined or are they too raw? Is there noticeable presence of heat from the alcohol? Is it aromatically complex? Does it have a long finish? Does it have good texture? Like these are all the actual structural elements. And so, at least in wine, we would call that deductive tasting. And so my goal is to apply that to whiskey by saying, okay, well, if you're going to say what's a good whiskey, not just do I like it or do I not like it, but what is a whiskey of quality? And I'm guessing you'd probably agree with these, as would most people, but aromatically complex, right?
I need a good nose. I
really do. Put your nose in the glass. You need a good nose, and you want it. And also what goes along with that is like intensity, right? If it could be that there's some interesting